Hello, welcome to Rebel Base, a Star Wars show for Star Wars people.
We'll have no trouble here. Hey everyone, we're tackling a big question today. Uncle George has been spouting off again. Say some crazy stuff. But first, we're going to talk about Elstree 1976.
Yeah, it's a documentary that's just come to our attention, and it's basically about 10 extras, or actors that are in Star Wars, but they appear for some reason behind masks and helmets. So there's your big ones in there. Yeah, you've got Jeremy Bulloch, who played Boba Fett. You've got David Prowse, who was in the
Vader suit.
The Vader suit. Yeah. Who has an amazing like West Country accent, although he does sound a tiny bit Welsh.
Stop trying to claim people as Welsh. You have Tom Jones. That's your lot.
We've got loads.
Geffen Jones.
We've got loads.
Okay.
But yeah, it's a documentary about their lives and how Star Wars has affected them. There's even one guy who's just part of the Empire, but he's in a helmet in the background, and he's pointed out on this photo like, oh yeah, there's me in the background there. But he's made a living off this, off this character.
Yeah.
And they go to cons all the time, and there's lots of footage of them at all these different conventions, sort of signing autographs and posing for photos with stuff. And there's big business to be made. There's a lot of money in
it looks like so there's a trailer out there that you can see.
Well, it's a Kickstarter video. So basically the movie's been shot, but they're kickstarting it so they can try and finish the film and get it distributed.
Right, okay.
There's a lot of really cool perks on there if you wanted to back it as well. One of them is to go watch the film at its premiere, which is actually going to take place on one of the Star Wars sound stages.
It's very
which
cool.
Is pretty cool, yeah.
Yeah, so it reminded me of a few things. There's a documentary on Netflix. What's it called? That guy who was in That Thing?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
And it's about these actors who are in loads of TV shows,
Yeah.
like character actors, but they're never the star.
Xander Berkeley's the big one.
Yeah, it's kind of a little bit of a tone like that. They're kind of unsung heroes of Star Wars.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, a lot of it as well, there's obviously stuff that goes on in it, but in the Kickstarter film, one of them talks about how apparently some of the bigger actors, obviously with lines and things, don't necessarily like the sort of extras sort of getting in there. But if you think like Boba Fett, like I remember queuing up when I was 13 years old at a convention in Cardiff to meet Jeremy Bulloch and get something signed by him. And like even then, like I think I paid about 15 quid just to get him to sign this, this picture of all the bounty hunters and stuff like that. But 15 quid, and there was a line, of hundreds of people, absolutely hundreds of people, and like he's getting a bit of money from that.
So there's a sliding scale of stardom. So if you have a line, you can charge a little bit more. If you're on screen, you can charge a little bit more.
Exactly,
if your face is visible.
I love the culture of conventions and things like that. Like it's done really, really well in Best Worst Movie, which is the documentary about Troll 2. And it shows them, like, they started going to these horror conventions and seeing that there was these people who loved them they never even thought of. And I really like that. I think this is captured really well in the film. So if you want to see the film, like head over to the Kickstarter and back in. Hopefully, you'll get a cinema release. Uncle George is back in the news, old Georgie boy.
What's he been saying?
It's odd, right? Because you hear nothing from George Lucas, and all of a sudden, he's showing up everywhere.
That's what happens when you got your animated movie out.
Yeah, exactly. So this time he was talking to Deadline, and he was at the Sundance Film Festival, every week saying something almost a little bit sort of bitey at Star Wars. This time he says, I really have no interest in science fiction at all. George Lucas hates sci-fi. So he says a lot of movies you see today are circus movies. Let's see how much blood comes out when it splats. It's now gotten to be more and more circus than substance.
Like, firstly, what circus is he going to?
Stop going. Like
I've been watching a lot of circus movies these days. And
it's not a Cirque du Soleil.
What are you watching? You're watching Funhouse.
I get blamed for a lot of that. If you go into Star Wars and see what's going on there's a lot more substance than circus. I don't think anyone is accusing you of that.
Yeah, but I just like the way if you go look at that Star Wars I made, there's a lot more going on there. Yeah, like you said the other week, when that thing comes over the thing. So, George.
But it's interesting.
No,
though, because,
we're taking the mick.
Of course,
we love George.
But it's interesting though because it's something that we've talked about quite a lot of whether or not Star Wars even is science fiction.
Yeah, so we're going to discuss that. A kind of weighty question.
Yeah.
It's been tackled many times, but we thought we'd just go over the kind of key arguments and points. Is Star Wars science fiction or is it fantasy?
Okay, yeah.
Is it somewhere in the middle?
So let's make the case for science fiction.
Okay.
So first of all, it depicts very advanced technology.
Yeah, and some of it is reasonable to assume could one day exist. Like things like lasers.
Yeah.
Lasers do
I think
exist.
lasers exist now.
Laser swords.
Okay, yeah.
But also colonization of other planets,
Yeah.
star travel, things like this, like hyperdrives, they all can be theoretically extrapolated in the future.
Yeah.
What I would say is Star Wars doesn't seem to get too hung up on the mechanics of those things.
No.
So even though it has very futuristic things in it,
Yeah.
it's not that interested in the actual science behind space travel. Yeah, I think the adventure is more important and the actual journey of its central characters.
Yeah, definitely.
Than like getting hung up on the machinery itself.
Yeah.
Saying that, I think what they did in the prequels with midichlorians
Right.
is very much science fiction.
Yeah, definitely,
Trying
yeah.
to add some kind of biological, genetic rationale for the Force is pure science fiction. I always say it's almost leaning towards hard SF, which is a school of science fiction which really gets interested in the actual science of how something could work.
Yeah.
You know, this is what you see in works like Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke.
Yeah.
You know, Arthur C. Clarke predicted geostationary orbits before they were even a thing. So he was very interested in that, and I think that's the closest maybe Star Wars gets in the actual movies.
But it definitely isn't hard science fiction, I don't think, because it doesn't really get bogged down in like scientific accuracy and things like that.
I think maybe some places like in the old extended universe you
Yeah.
can find and learn more about lightsabers and the crystals, but
Of course,
it's definitely not there in the movies. They don't dwell upon that.
definitely not, yeah.
But I think, you know, science fiction as a genre is really expansive and elastic, and there's lots of different subgenres within science fiction that maybe Star Wars could be situated within quite comfortably.
Okay, yeah.
So like, you know, the soft science fiction, which is less interested in the science and more using a kind of science fiction setting to discuss kind of social and political issues. This is like, you know, Philip K. Dick did this really well, and psychological issues. And I think Star Wars kind of does that. It tackles like politics and social situations and extrapolates them to this huge intergalactic level. So a lot of political stuff in Star Wars, which is set up, you know, against the background of stars.
Yeah, and I hope that, you know, that's in the movies that are coming. I hope that's tackled quite a lot, because as we've said before, like, you know, we said in the last episode where we said, like, you know, we wanted to feel more like House of Cards and that kind of thing, and space just happens to be the backdrop. It's like the same as like Battlestar Galactica. Like that couldn't have been in space. That could have been anywhere, but it just happened to be set there and uses space as a setting rather than it to take over, sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm going to throw another subgenre at you.
Okay.
What about space opera?
Yeah.
So space opera is kind of, I guess, like, it has nothing to do with music. It's to do, like, obviously riffing off soap opera.
Yeah.
So downplaying the science, but playing up the kind of romance, adventure elements, kind of channeling, like Saturday morning serials and stuff like that. And obviously that's a big part of Star Wars. You know, George Lucas also went on and worked on Indiana Jones with Spielberg, and I think that's the influence. That's the kind of the commonality between both Star Wars and Indiana Jones, is that sense of adventure.
But I think that almost leads us into it being fantasy.
Yeah,
though,
I think
doesn't
we're
it?
kind
Like,
of going down the spectrum and we're heading towards...
Everything you say about space opera to me, like adventure, romance, that's everything that I would, and you said it yourself, Indiana Jones. Like Indiana Jones, awesome fantasy. That's what I would put Star Wars.
Yeah, because I think maybe rightly, wrongly, you always kind of think of science fiction as being quite cold and clinical.
Yeah,
you know, we've illustrated this with a picture from 2001, and a lot of kind of really hard traditional science fiction perhaps has that kind of surface.
Yeah.
But let's get onto the fantasy stuff and why we might kind of describe it as fantasy.
Well, I think the Force is the big one.
Yeah,
so like, because it's quite mystical, and the Force almost exists in every single fantasy type thing.
Yeah, it's
really.
almost like akin to magic, really. It is indistinguishable from magic. And while kind of the idea of midichlorians might explain some of the ways the Force works within the universe, I don't think it quite accounts for things like the ghosts and hearing the voices and stuff like that. That's when we get into like mystical, spiritual territory.
Huge, yeah, and that's such a massive part of it, and you can't explain that with science.
Yeah, and I think there's just this kind of, and we're going to get onto this, a really important book that people often cite in relation to Star Wars, which is The Hero with a Thousand Faces by a guy called Joseph Campbell. And now I think Lucas only was aware of this book when he'd done a couple of drafts of Star Wars already.
Really?
But it's hugely important to kind of, it's a study of like mythology, Western mythology in particular, and it draws on the fact that no matter what the culture, all myths have kind of common elements that occur again and again that are kind of transcultural.
That's right,
and the same can be said of a lot of kind of fantasy narratives.
Yeah.
They're built out of these kind of archetypes and building blocks, and Star Wars adheres to them very, very closely, as do things like Harry Potter.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I think recently there was this thing going around where it was a description, it was a plot summary of Star Wars, and you crossed out all the major names, and you could quite easily replace them with names from Harry Potter, and it still works. It's still the exact kind of structure.
Okay, that's really interesting, yeah. I guess it's like the hero's journey, isn't it? Like, it has to have these archetypes, it has to have the sort of mentor. And when you start looking at like screenwriting books like Hero's Journey and things like that, like you see, oh, this is Star Wars, it's 100% Star Wars.
Yeah, because there's a lot of kind of theories about writing that there are only 7 plots.
Yeah.
That you reconfigure in very different ways, and all kind of Western narratives are based upon them. But yeah, Star Wars has a lot of them. It has the youth on the quest, evil lord, boy learns magic to defeat evil.
Yeah.
Star Wars, that's also Harry Potter. It's also a lot of other things.
It's everything.
So we're entering way more fantasy territory with, I think, the core narrative of Star Wars.
Yeah. Well, Daniel, I'd like to end this discussion with a quote from Mr. George Lucas himself, who says, "As a kid, I read a lot of science fiction, nerd. But instead of reading technical hard science writers like Isaac Asimov, I was interested in Harry Harrison and a fantastic surreal approach to the genre. I grew up on it. Star Wars is a sort of compilation of this stuff, but it's never put in one story before, never put down on film. There's a lot taken from westerns, mythology, and samurai movies. It's all the things that are great put together. It's not like one kind of ice cream, but rather a very big sundae," which is what we said. It's a mix of all this
amalgamation.
Different cool stuff put together.
It's the distillation of everything George Lucas was influenced as a kid, which is the same for a lot of creators. That's what Star Wars comes from. But shall we end with another quote? Quote off.
Quote off. Let's do it.
This is Arthur C. Clarke, the great British science fiction writer. "Science fiction is something that could happen, but usually you wouldn't want it to. Fantasy is something that couldn't happen, though often you wish that it could."
That is interesting, but we want to know what you think. So let us know on Twitter, in the comments below, or rebelbase@ign.com.
Yeah, and for all your Star Wars needs, stay right here on IGN.